Today, we will talk about market experiments. What they are, how they are done, and what we can learn from them. As you remember from the market equilibrium video, the theory of supply and demand was introduced by Alfred Marshall. We saw how we could derive supply and demand curves from individual sellers' unit costs and individual buyers' reservation values. This resulted in the step functions shown in the left graph. We further defined equilibrium as the point at where supply and demand crossed. In our example, this resulted in a price of $5 and a quantity of 4 units sold. We also demonstrated how the equilibrium price would change in response to shifts in supply and demand. In our example, when demand shifts up, the equilibrium price is predicted to change from $5 to around $6.50. Hayek pointed out that individual values and unit costs are private information known only to buyers and sellers. Therefore, no one knows the total supply and demand curve for any market. If this is so, how do we know if the theory of supply and demand is true? It was not until Vernon Smith learned how to run market experiments that we could truly test the theory. In 2002, he received the Nobel Prize in Economics for his development of experimental economics. As an undergraduate, Vernon Smith attended Caltech, where he developed an appreciation for experiments as a crucial component of the scientific method. After extensive experimentation and critical thinking, he developed a methodology for conducting controlled economic experiments in the laboratory. The primary goal in designing an experiment is to empirically study the effect of changes in a set of treatment variables. However, what makes the experimental methodology powerful is the ability to control experimental conditions, allowing the same empirical results to be replicated by any other scientist in their laboratory. By replicating the results in their own laboratory, a scientist can answer the question, "Do you see what I see?" This allows scientists to build a consensus on the facts surrounding a phenomenon of interest. Smith's framework for designing and building an economic experiment consists of 3 elements. The first element is the reservation values and unit costs of the buyers and sellers. The second element is the institution or set of rules that allows buyers and sellers to make trades. The third element is the behavior of buyers and sellers as they interact within the institution and produce trades. In an experiment, we control the first and second elements, and we observe the third element. How do we control the reservation values and unit costs of buyers and sellers? Smith used an ingenious system first built by Edward Chamberlain. He gave each subject a card with the information shown. Buyers were given their reservation value for each unit they could buy. They were told that when they bought a unit, they would record the price they paid below the value of the unit, starting with the first unit and proceeding in order. When the experiment was over, the experimenter would pay them the difference between the value and the price they paid for each unit. By paying the difference, buyers were incentivized to obtain the lowest price possible for each unit. Furthermore, the information on the card was private and should not be shared with anyone else. Sellers also got a card with their unit costs. They recorded the price they received above the unit cost. They were told they would be paid the difference between the price and the cost as experimental earnings. This incentivized sellers to obtain the highest price possible for each unit. Sellers were also told that the information on the card was private information and should not be shared with anyone else. Notice the reservation values and unit costs on the card's graph, a supply and demand curve that the experimenter knows, but no individual participant knows. From this graph, we can calculate the equilibrium price and quantity. The experimenter now knows the supply and demand curves, but the participants do not. This means we can now test the theory of supply and demand. Note that replication depends on our ability to control these reservation values and unit costs. The hope is that paying for the earnings based on the actual outcomes produced will allow us to replicate. What are the sufficient conditions that must be true if we want to replicate one of Smith's experiments and see for ourselves what happens? First, subjects must prefer more money to less. Second, subjects get paid according to the earnings rules we described. Third, the earnings are sufficiently large to crowd out any other rewards and costs incurred by their decisions. If the conditions of monotonicity, saliency, and dominance hold, then subjects will behave as if the values and costs are their own preferences, that is, what matters to them. Now that we have defined values and costs, we can proceed to defining the market institution. A market institution has 4 parts. First, an institution has a message space that defines all the messages that can be sent between the participants and the institution. Second, An institution has a state space that defines the set of possible states the institution can be in. Third, an institution has a set of governance rules that determine what messages subjects can send to the institution. Fourth, an institution has a set of production rules that change its state, produce outcomes, and decide on messages to send back to participants. An example message space for a double auction institution is shown here. A buyer can submit a bid message in the form buyer ID bid price, indicating the price the buyer with that ID is willing to pay for 1 unit. A seller can submit an ask message in the form seller ID ask price, indicating the price the seller with that ID is willing to sell 1 unit of the good. A buyer can also submit a buy message indicating they are willing to buy a unit at the lowest current price offered by a seller. Similarly, a seller can submit a sell message indicating they are willing to sell a unit at the highest current price offered by a buyer. Once we have messages that can be sent, we can define the rules of the double auction. These rules are shown in the example rules on this slide and the next. Pause the video and take a moment to read them. Can you identify which are governance rules and which are production rules? Here is the second set of rules. Again, you should pause the video and take your time to read them. Let's look at how the rules would be applied in an actual experiment. The experimenter draws the T-diagram with the labels shown and enters a bid of 0 and an ask of 999. These indicate the bounds for bids and asks. The experimenter then says the market is open. Buyer 2 is recognized and says, Buyer B2, bid $3. The experimenter writes this on the board. Sellers S3 and S1 then make asks of $7 and $6, respectively. For example, for the second ask, Seller 1 was recognized and said, Seller S1, ask $6. The experimenter first verifies that the message is valid according to the improvement rule, which states that new asks must be lower than the ask currently on the board. In this case, $6 was lower than the previous ask of $7. Next, Buyer 1 is recognized again and says, Buyer B1, bid $4. Since the bid of $4 improves on the bid of $3, it is accepted and put on the board. Notice, we call the highest bid offered so far and the lowest ask offered so far the bid-ask spread. Notice that the improvement rules guarantee the bid-ask spread will decrease with new bids and asks. In the final step of this example, Seller 1 sends the message S1 sell. This creates a contract between Buyer 1 and Seller 1 at the price of $4, which is what Buyer 1 bid and is the current standing bid. The experimenter records the contract, then restarts the board at 0 and 999, and reopens the market. Over time, the order flow in the market results in several contracts. We can graph these contract prices to see how actual prices behave. This is the dial that Hayek was referring to. Other people can see these prices, which reflect the relative scarcity of this good, and make decisions based on their private information and the prices revealed. In his 1962 paper, Smith reported the results of his market experiments. In Chart 1, we see the supply and demand curve he induced, and the market prices produced by the double auction participants. The lines represent the start of a new market period. Each period, Smith assigned the participants the reservation values and unit costs they had in the previous period and started the market. Each period represents one run of the double auction market. Over time, the market converged to the competitive equilibrium. Smith found this result amazing and decided to test the limits of supply and demand theory by experimenting with various market supply and demand scenarios. Here in Chart 9, he uses supply and demand curves, which give most of the equilibrium total surplus to sellers. Will this cause buyers to hold out for better prices? Initially they do, but over time, the market converges to equilibrium. Then in the fourth period, Smith shifts demand out, and sure enough, prices start moving to the new equilibrium. Since Smith ran his first double auction experiments, his results have been replicated thousands of times by experimenters in other labs and in classrooms around the world. Smith's results have continued to hold and suggest that Marshall's theory of supply and demand works, and works even better than economists thought it would. While a general theory of bid and ask strategies in double auction has eluded economic theorists, many properties of these strategies are now well known. For example, a sniper strategy lets other people define the standing bid and ask, and then snipes these offers with buy and sell messages. This is largely how programmed arbitrage strategies work. We are now able to define a microeconomic system for a double auction market. It consists of a supply and demand environment and an institution which defines a state, has a message space, and produces contracts or trades. The behavior of the subjects is given by the messages they choose to send and the contracts that are then produced. The experimenter controls the environment, defines the institution, and then conducts experiments to observe the messages people send and the outcomes that are produced. Thank you.